The trailhead stood as a ghost of its former self, a rusted iron gate cloaked in creeping vines. A sun-bleached sign dangled limply, bearing the faded words, "Closed, danger beyond." For decades, rumors of the vanished trail had circulated through town, a cursed route winding through the jagged peaks of Black Hollow Ridge. Its reputation as a place of eerie disappearances had become local folklore, a tale told to thrill tourists and scare children. But for the 5 hikers gathered at its threshold, the trail was more than a myth. Emily adjusted the straps of her overloaded pack, her eyes scanning the worn path ahead. A wilderness researcher with a passion for debunking legends, she'd organized the trek. It wasn't her first dangerous hike, but the ominous quiet of the forest already pressed against her nerves. "This is our chance to make history," she said more to herself than the group. "We'll find the truth about this place." Behind her, Nick smirked, flipping the blade of his pocket knife open and shut. "Truth, huh? You mean like a ghost story for your next book?" He was the glory seeker of the group, a thrill junkie who craved danger like oxygen. "Don't disrespect the trail," grumbled Victor, the oldest among them, his weathered face set in a grim expression. A retired park ranger, he had been the one to suggest that the trail's closure was more than just a bureaucratic safety measure. But he hadn't said why. Mia, clutching a small leather notebook, lingered near the back. She had hardly spoken since they arrived, her gaze fixed on the gate. She was there to find her brother, who had disappeared on this very trail 5 years ago. "Let's just get moving," she said quietly, not looking at anyone. Finally, there was Sam, the tech expert, outfitted with cameras and GPS devices. He glanced at his watch, which had already lost signal. "We should be fine as long as we stick to the plan," he said, a faint tremor betraying his attempt at confidence. As they crossed the threshold, the world seemed to exhale. The forest ahead was dense, its trees impossibly tall, their twisted branches forming a cathedral of shadows. Overhead, the sky darkened, though it was only mid-afternoon. Emily studied the first of many strange markings on the moss-covered rocks. They appeared to be geometric symbols, sharp and angular, etched with precision. "This wasn't done by nature," she murmured, running her fingers over the grooves. "Great," Nick said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Trail's already haunted, and we've barely started." The group pressed on, their boots crunching against the uneven path. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the world became. The wind stirred through the trees with an unnatural cadence, carrying whispers too faint to understand, but too deliberate to dismiss. Half an hour in, Mia stopped dead in her tracks. "Did anyone hear that?" "Hear what?" Victor asked, his hand reflexively brushing the knife on his belt. "That laugh," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "It came from up ahead." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Emily pressed forward, determined not to let fear derail them so soon. "It's just the wind," she insisted, though she didn't believe it. Behind them, a branch snapped. Everyone froze. Sam swung his flashlight toward the sound, but nothing moved in the shadows. "I thought you said there's no wildlife in these parts," Nick said, his bravado faltering. "There shouldn't be," Victor replied grimly. The group continued, now walking faster. They passed more markings on tree trunks, scattered rocks, even scratched faintly into the ground. Emily cataloged them with her camera, but the images distorted strangely, no matter how carefully she framed them. An hour later, they reached the first clearing. The view should have been breathtaking, rugged cliffs dropping into a mist-filled valley, but the horizon was obscured by an oppressive gray fog. Victor knelt by a pile of rotted wood near the edge. "Looks like a shelter collapsed here," he said, pulling out a rusted tin box from the debris. Inside was a faded journal, the cover torn but still legible. He handed it to Emily. She opened it, scanning the cramped handwriting. "To whoever finds this, turn back now. We didn't listen, and now it's too late." The air seemed to grow colder as the group huddled around the journal, each of them wondering what lay ahead. None of them spoke the thought that hung heavy in the air. They weren't alone. The hikers moved on from the collapsed shelter in uneasy silence. Each step seemed heavier now, as if the warning in the journal had sunk into their bones. The air grew colder, and the trail narrowed, flanked by walls of jagged rock that loomed over them like sentinels. Emily clutched the journal, thumbing through its brittle pages. The entries were erratic, fragmented, as if the writer had scrawled them in haste or terror. Words like trapped, watching, and don't look back jumped out at her. She shivered, though the wind was still. Nick's voice broke the tension. "You guys buy any of this crap?" he asked, though his forced laugh betrayed him. "Some guy gets lost, starts scribbling nonsense, and now it's supposed to scare us off." Victor shot him a warning look. "People don't leave journals for fun, kid. And those markings aren't some camp prank." "What markings?" Mia asked suddenly. They stopped, and Emily pointed to a nearby rock. The strange, angular symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Sam crouched to examine them. "They're geometric. Could be a kind of language or maybe a warning system. Or decoration," Nick said, his smirk returning. Sam ignored him, holding up a scanner attached to his phone. "Weird. It's giving off some kind of magnetic interference." "Like what?" Victor asked. "I don't know. Nothing natural," Sam muttered, his voice uneasy. The hikers continued, but the forest seemed to close in tighter with every step. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was littered with remnants of old campsites, rusted cooking pots, shredded tarps, and even a half-buried boot. "I don't like this," Mia said, hugging her notebook to her chest. "It feels wrong, like the trail's alive or something." "It's just your imagination," Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. Another noise stopped them in their tracks, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the forest to their left, just beyond the line of sight. "What is that?" Sam whispered, holding his flashlight toward the sound. The beam of light wavered as he scanned the woods. For a moment, it landed on something, a shadow darting between the trees. "There!" he shouted. The group turned to look, but the shadow was gone. Only the swaying branches marked where it had been. "Probably just an animal," Victor said, though his grip on his knife tightened. "Yeah? What kind of animal walks upright and doesn't leave tracks?" Nick shot back. No one had an answer. They pressed on, tension mounting. As the trail wound upward, the fog thickened, swirling around them in cold, damp tendrils. Emily noticed the markings were becoming more frequent now, etched deeper into the rocks and trees. "It's like a trail of breadcrumbs," she murmured. "Or a trap," Victor muttered under his breath. Ahead, a massive boulder blocked part of the path, its surface slick with moss and rain. The hikers moved around it, but as Emily passed, her fingers brushed against something carved into its surface. She turned to look and gasped. The symbol was different from the others, a spiraling shape with jagged edges. It seemed to pulse faintly under her touch, and a wave of nausea rolled through her. "Emily," Mia asked, her voice tense. Emily pulled her hand back as if burned. "It's nothing. Let's keep going." But it wasn't nothing. The strange spiral lingered in her mind, almost as if it had been imprinted there. The group rounded a bend, and the path opened into a second clearing. Here, they found the remnants of another campsite, a torn tent, a rusted lantern, and scattered bones. "Jesus," Nick whispered, his bravado gone. "What the hell happened here?" Victor stepped forward, inspecting the scene with a grim expression. "These bones, they're old. Decades, maybe." Mia knelt by the lantern, picking up a crumpled piece of paper wedged inside it. The edges were singed, and the ink had bled, but she could still make out the words, "It doesn't let you leave." "What doesn't let you leave?" she asked aloud, her voice trembling. The answer came not in words, but in sound, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the clearing. The group froze, their breath visible in the cold air. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sam asked, his voice barely audible. Victor drew his knife, his eyes scanning the forest. "We need to move. Now!" Emily wanted to agree, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. She could feel something watching them, its gaze heavy and cold. The growl came again, louder this time. "Run," Victor ordered, and they did. The hikers sprinted blindly through the fog-laden forest, the growls echoing behind them. The sound grew louder, more guttural, as if the unseen predator was gaining on them. Branches clawed at their faces, Roots threatened to trip them, but they kept moving, hearts hammering in their chests. "Keep going," Victor barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "What is that thing?" Mia cried, clutching her notebook as she ran. "Don't stop to find out," Sam shouted, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the chaos. The group broke through a thicket and stumbled into another section of the trail. Here, the path was narrower, lined with precarious cliffs that dropped into a swirling abyss of fog. "Careful," Emily shouted, skidding to a stop just short of the edge. The growling ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The hikers huddled together, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Did we lose it?" Nick asked, his voice trembling for the first time. Victor scanned the surrounding trees, his knife glinting in the faint light. "Maybe, but we're not safe yet. Keep moving." The group edged forward cautiously, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on gravel. The fog seemed thicker here, smothering the trail in a suffocating gray shroud. "I can't see a thing," Sam muttered, his GPS device sputtering and failing to recalibrate. "This thing's useless." Emily glanced over her shoulder, her unease growing. "Stay close. We can't afford to get separated." The words were barely out of her mouth when the ground beneath Nick gave way with a sickening crack. He yelped as his leg plunged into a hidden crevice, pinning him in place. "Nick!" Mia shouted, rushing to his side. "I'm stuck," he yelled, panic overtaking his bravado. He tugged at his leg, but the jagged rocks held fast, cutting into his skin. Victor crouched beside him, inspecting the crevice. "Hold still. If you move too much, you'll make it worse." "Hurry!" Nick snapped, his voice rising. "It's still out there?" As Victor worked to free him, Emily felt it again, that heavy, unrelenting gaze. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the trees. The fog parted briefly, and she saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall, standing motionless among the twisted trunks. "Victor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're not alone." The shadow stepped forward, its movements unnatural, like a puppet with its strings cut. Its form was indistinct, but its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce the fog. Victor saw it too, his hand tightening on his knife. "Stay calm. Don't run." Nick screamed as the shadow lunged, its form blurring like smoke. It moved within human speed, reaching Nick before anyone could react. "No!" Victor shouted, slashing at the thing with his knife, but it passed through the shadow as if it weren't solid. Nick's screams turned to gurgles as the shadow enveloped him, pulling him deeper into the crevice. His flashlight fell to the ground, flickering weakly before going dark. "Nick!" Mia cried, reaching out, but Victor yanked her back. "Stay away. You can't help him," he barked. Within seconds, the shadow and Nick were gone, leaving nothing but an eerie stillness and the faint scent of decay. Emily clutched her chest, her breath shallow. "Well, what just happened?" Victor stood, his expression grim. "We need to keep moving." "Are you kidding me?" Mia shouted, tears streaming down her face. "We can't just leave him." "He's gone," Victor said flatly, his voice tinged with something like regret. "And if we stay here, we'll be next." Emily placed a trembling hand on Mia's shoulder. "He's right. We have to go." Mia hesitated, her gaze lingering on the crevice where her friend had vanished. Then, with a sob, she nodded. The group moved on, their spirits fractured. The trail seemed to grow more perilous with every step. Rocks shifting underfoot, the fog twisting into strange shapes. Sam's voice broke the silence. "What was that thing?" Victor didn't answer, his jaw set. "It was a human," Emily said softly. "It was something else. Something that's been here all along," Victor muttered, barely audible. "What do you mean?" Mia asked, her voice wavering. Victor hesitated, then sighed. "This trail, it's not just cursed. It's a trap. It draws people in, feeds on them. That's why it was closed." "And you knew?" Emily said, her voice rising. "I suspected," Victor admitted, "but I didn't know for sure. Not until now." Anger flashed in Mia's tear-streaked face. "You brought us here knowing this could happen?" "I thought we could outsmart it," Victor snapped. "I thought we could survive." Emily stepped between them. "Stop it. Fighting won't help us. We need to focus on getting out of here." Another sound cut through the tension, a faint, echoing laughter that sent chills down their spines. They weren't out of danger yet. The trail seemed endless, winding through the dense forest and jagged cliffs like a serpent coiled around its prey. Every step the hikers took was weighted with dread, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. The laughter had faded, but its echo lingered in their minds, a cruel reminder that they were being toyed with. Mia trudged along at the back of the group, her shoulders slumped under the weight of grief and exhaustion. Her brother's face flashed in her mind, his hopeful smile, when he'd told her about his plans to hike this trail. She had come to find closure, but now she feared she'd share his fate. Ahead, Victor stopped abruptly, his hand raised in a silent signal. The group froze. "What is it?" Emily whispered. Victor pointed toward the path ahead. Through the thick fog, they could make out something lying in the dirt. It was long and dark, tangled in the underbrush. Slowly, they approached, their footsteps cautious. "It's a rope," Sam said, kneeling down to inspect it. Emily's stomach churned as she realized what it really was, a weathered climbing harness, its straps frayed and stained with something dark. Victor frowned, picking it up and turning it over. A name was scrawled in faded marker on the inside. L. Harper. "That's from the last documented group," Victor said, his voice low. "They disappeared in the 90s. Harper was one of them." Emily glanced around uneasily. "If this is here, where's the rest of him?" A faint noise answered her, a dragging sound, soft but deliberate, coming from the woods to their right. "Stay together," Victor said, his grip tightening on his knife. The group huddled closer as the sound grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. "I don't see anything," Sam said, shining his flashlight into the trees. "That doesn't mean it's not there," Victor replied, his eyes scanning the shadows. The fog thickened again, swirling like smoke and muffling the sounds of their own breathing. Emily's chest tightened, her instincts screaming that they were being watched. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a flicker of movement in the mist. A figure, barely visible, stood just beyond the tree line. It was human-shaped, but wrong, its limbs too long and its posture unnaturally rigid. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Victor turned, following her gaze, and froze. "Yeah, I see it." The figure didn't move, but its head tilted slightly, as if studying them. Its face was a blank, smooth expanse devoid of features. What is that?" Sam stammered, his voice breaking. The figure stepped forward, and the fog seemed to retreat around it, revealing its full form. Its body was emaciated, its skin stretched taut over sharp bones, and its fingers ended in claw-like tips. "Run," Victor said, his voice low and steady. No one argued. They bolted down the trail, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. The fog parted around them, and the air felt heavier with every breath. Behind them, the creature followed, its movements unervingly slow but purposeful. "It's not stopping," Mia cried, her voice rising in panic. "It doesn't need to," Victor replied grimly. As they ran, the trail narrowed further, the cliffs on either side dropping into a void of swirling mist. Emily's lungs burned, but she forced herself to keep going, her mind focused on survival. Ahead, Sam stumbled, his foot catching on a root. He hit the ground hard, his flashlight skidding away. Emily shouted, turning back. Victor stopped and hauled Sam to his feet. "Move," he barked. Sam grabbed his flashlight and scrambled forward, but the delay cost them. The creature was closer now, its inhuman form silhouetted against the fog. "We're not going to outrun it," Mia gasped, her voice thick with fear. Victor's eyes darted to the cliffside. "Then we make a stand." "Here, you're insane," some shouted. Victor ignored him, stepping to the edge of the trail. "Emily, Sam, keep going. Get to higher ground. Mia, stay with me." "No," Emily said firmly. "We're not splitting up again." The creature stopped a few yards away, its head tilting again in that unnerving way. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if deciding how to proceed. Then it lunged, Victor moved first, his knife flashing as he slashed at the creature's outstretched arm. The blade cut deep, but instead of blood, a black, viscous liquid oozed from the wound. The creature let out a shriek that reverberated through the cliffs, making the hiker's ears ring. Sam grabbed a loose rock and hurled it, striking the creature's torso. It barely flinched, its focus fixed on Victor. "Go!" Victor shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I'll hold it off." Emily hesitated, torn between survival and loyalty. But the look in Victor's eyes left no room for argument. "Come on!" Sam yelled, pulling her arm. Emily and Sam sprinted up the trail, Mia close behind. The last thing Emily saw as she glanced back was Victor standing his ground, his knife raised. The creature pounced, and Victor disappeared into the fog. Victor's scream echoed through the mountains, chilling them to the core. They didn't stop running. The remaining hikers stumbled up the narrowing trail, their breath ragged and their legs trembling with exhaustion. The fog clung to them like damp sheets, muffling every sound except their pounding footsteps. Emily's mind raced, replaying Victor's final stand. His scream echoed in her memory, a haunting cry of defiance and despair. She had wanted to stay, to fight, but she knew Victor's sacrifice had bought them precious seconds. Why did we leave him? Mia choked out, her voice cracking with emotion. "We should have. We couldn't have done anything," Sam interrupted sharply, his voice edged with fear. "If we stayed, we'd all be dead. We might still be," Emily muttered, glancing over her shoulder. The fog behind them was dense and impenetrable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving within it, stalking them. They reached a sharp bend in the trail, where a gnarled tree jutted out over the cliffside like a skeletal arm. Sam leaned against it, clutching his chest and trying to catch his breath. "I need a minute," he panted. Emily nodded, her own body screaming for rest. She looked at Mia, who sat on a nearby rock, her face pale and streaked with tears. "He didn't have to die," Mia whispered, staring blankly at the ground. Emily crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Victor knew what he was doing. "He saved us." "For how long?" Mia shot back, her eyes glistening with anger and despair. Sam straightened, his hands trembling as he fiddled with his malfunctioning GPS. "We don't have time for this. We need to keep moving before that thing catches up." Emily frowned, glancing at his device. "Still nothing?" "Nothing. It's like the entire area is jamming the signal," he muttered. Mia's voice was a whisper, almost lost in the wind. "What if it wants us to keep moving?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emily didn't want to admit it, but the thought had crossed her mind too. "Let's just stay focused," she said, standing and brushing off her hands. "There has to be a way out of here." The group pressed on, the trail narrowing further until they were walking single file along the edge of a steep ravine. Below, the fog churned like a living thing, obscuring the ground from view. "Careful," Emily warned, her voice hushed. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the cliffs and rattling loose stones. The sound was deafening, a cacophony that drowned out their own thoughts. "Hold on to something," Sam shouted, grabbing a protruding rock for balance. Mia screamed as her notebook was ripped from her hands, the pages scattering into the abyss. She lunged after it instinctively, and Emily grabbed her arm just in time. "Don't!" Emily shouted, pulling Mia back from the edge. Mia's eyes were wide with panic. "That was all I had left of him." "I know," Emily said, her voice firm but gentle. "But we can't help him if we don't survive this." The wind died down as abruptly as it had started, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. "That wasn't natural," Sam said, his voice low. "Nothing here is," Emily replied grimly. The group continued in tense silence, every step a cautious negotiation with the crumbling path. Ahead, the trail widened into a small plateau, where they found another strange sight. A ring of stones, blackened as if by fire, sat in the center of the plateau. Surrounding it were crude carvings etched into the ground. More of the angular symbols they had seen earlier, but larger and more intricate. "What is this?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Emily knelt to examine the carvings. It looks like some kind of ritual site, she said, tracing the lines with her fingers. Maybe this is why the trail was closed. Something happened here. Sam picked up a broken camera lying near the stones. Its lens was cracked, and the body was covered in dirt, but the memory card was still intact. This might tell us something, he said, pocketing it. Mia hugged herself, her eyes darting nervously around the plateau. I don't like this. It feels wrong. Emily stood, her expression serious. We need to keep moving. Whatever this place is, it's not safe. As they turned to leave, the ground beneath their feet rumbled. The carvings seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Run! Emily shouted. The hikers bolted back toward the trail, the rumbling growing louder behind them. As they reached the edge of the plateau, a deafening crack split the air. Emily looked back just in time to see the ring of stones collapse inward, the carvings glowing brightly before vanishing into darkness. What the hell was that? Sam yelled, his voice shaking. I don't know, Emily replied, her heart pounding. But I think we just triggered something. The trail ahead stretched endlessly into the fog, but the hikers had no choice but to press on, their resolve shaken and their fear mounting. Behind them, the plateau fell silent, but the sense of being watched remained. Something was following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hikers pressed forward, their steps hurried and uneven, the oppressive fog curling around them like a living thing. Each of them carried the weight of Victor's sacrifice and the unnerving collapse of the ritual site, their nerves fraying with every passing moment. The trail narrowed again, twisting sharply between jagged cliffs that cast deep shadows across the path. Emily took the lead, her flashlight slicing through the gloom. Behind her, Mia and Sam followed in silence, their faces pale and drawn. We've been walking for hours, Mia muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. We should have come across something, anything, by now. We're going in circles, Sam said, his frustration boiling over. I swear we've passed that tree before. He pointed to a gnarled pine with a split trunk, its bark scarred with more of the strange markings. No, Emily replied firmly, though doubt crept into her voice. We're heading in the right direction. We have to be. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The landmarks all seemed to blur together, and the trail felt endless, twisting and looping back on itself. Sam stopped abruptly, pulling the broken camera from his pocket. Let's see what's on this thing, he said, his fingers trembling as he pried out the memory card. You think it'll work? Emily asked, watching as he slotted it into his phone. Only one way to find out, Sam muttered, pulling up the files. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy, distorted footage. The camera's previous owner, a man in a battered hiking jacket, appeared on the screen, his face drawn and hollow. If you're watching this, the man said, his voice shaking, then you've already made the same mistake we did. The footage jumped, static tearing through the image. When it stabilized, the man was no longer alone. Behind him, shadowy figures loomed in the fog, their forms flickering like bad reception on an old TV. It doesn't let you leave, the man continued, his eyes darting nervously toward the figures. It watches. It waits. And when it's ready, the video cut off abruptly, the screen going black. Sam cursed under his breath, shoving the phone back into his pocket. Great. That tells us nothing. It tells us everything, Mia said, her voice trembling. He was right. This trail isn't just dangerous. It's alive. It's trapping us here. Emily's stomach churned at the thought. She wanted to argue, to dismiss it as paranoia, but the evidence was mounting. The strange markings, the ritual site, the shadowy figures, they all pointed to something far beyond her understanding. Then we'll outsmart it, she said, trying to muster confidence. We'll find a way out. A sharp crack echoed through the fog, cutting her off. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. What was that? Mia whispered, clutching Emily's arm. The sound came again, closer this time. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath their feet. Emily raised her flashlight, sweeping it across the trees. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, something moved. It was a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it stepped forward. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a featureless void, a black abyss that seemed to absorb the light. "Run," Emily said, her voice barely audible. They bolted, their footsteps pounding against the uneven trail. The fog seemed to thicken around them, slowing their movements and distorting the landscape. Trees appeared where there had been none, their gnarled branches clawing at the hikers as they passed. "This way," Emily shouted, veering left at a fork in the trail. "Are you sure?" Sam called, struggling to keep up. "No," she admitted, panic lacing her voice. The path sloped downward, leading them into a narrow ravine. The air grew colder, and the ground was slick with mud, making every step treacherous. Mia stumbled, falling to her knees with a cry of pain. Emily skidded to a stop, reaching out to help her up. "I can't," Mia sobbed, clutching her ankle. "It hurts too much." "You can," Emily insisted, pulling her arm around her shoulders. "We're not leaving you behind." The growl came again, louder and more guttural, vibrating through the ravine like thunder. Sam stopped ahead of them, his flashlight flickering. "Guys!" Emily looked up and felt her blood run cold. The path ahead was blocked by more of the shadowy figures, their forms flickering and shifting like static. They stood motionless, their featureless faces turned toward the group. "They're everywhere," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Emily scanned their surroundings, her mind racing. "Up there," she said, pointing to a rocky incline that led out of the ravine. "It's too steep," Sam argued. "Do you have a better idea?" Emily snapped. Without waiting for an answer, she started up the incline, half carrying Mia as she climbed. Sam hesitated, glancing back at the figures, before following. The climb was grueling, every muscle in Emily's body screaming in protest. The fog clung to her skin, cold and clammy, and the growls grew louder, echoing off the ravine walls. They reached the top just as the figures began to move, their twisted limbs reaching out for the hikers. "Go!" Emily shouted, pushing Mia ahead of her. The three of them stumbled onto a flat stretch of trail, gasping for breath. Behind them, the shadowy figures paused at the base of the incline, their movements slow and deliberate. "They're not following us," Sam said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Not yet," Emily muttered, her heart pounding. "But they will." The hikers turned and ran, the fog closing in around them once more. The hikers pressed on, their bodies aching and their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The fog wrapped around them, oppressive and unyielding, while the trees seemed to twist and lean closer, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Emily led the way, her flashlight beam flickering weakly in the heavy mist. Behind her, Sam trudged forward with a grim expression, his eyes darting nervously at every sound. Mia limped along at the back, clutching her side, her breath shallow and ragged. The trail grew narrower, hemmed in by jagged rock walls that towered over them. The air felt heavier, tinged with a metallic tang that clung to their tongues. "What is this place?" Mia muttered, her voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. She didn't know how to put her growing sense of dread into words. The trail no longer felt like a path meant for human travel. It felt like a throat, swallowing them deeper into its unknown depths. A faint sound broke the oppressive silence. At first, it was barely audible, like the hum of distant wind. But as they continued, it grew louder, resolving into whispers. "Do you hear that?" Sam asked, stopping in his tracks. Emily nodded, her grip tightening on her flashlight. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, slipping through the fog like unseen hands. "Voices," Mia whispered. "They're calling to us." "No," Emily said firmly, shaking her head. "It's not real. It's just the wind or—" The words died in her throat as the whispers took on an unmistakable clarity. "Help us," the voices pleaded, soft and mournful. Mia froze, her eyes wide with fear. That's his voice. My brother." "It's not," Emily said, grabbing her arm. "It's a trick." But Mia pulled away, her gaze fixed on the fog ahead. "I know his voice. He's calling for me. Mia, stop, Emily shouted. But Mia was already running, her limp forgotten as she disappeared into the fog. Damn it, Sam swore, bolting after her. Emily followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her ears until she could barely think. Emily, a voice called, soft and familiar. She froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. It was her mother's voice, clear as day. Emily, come home, the voice said, trembling with emotion. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she saw a figure standing in the fog. It was her mother, her face pale and her arms outstretched. No, Emily muttered, shaking her head. You're not real. The figure stepped closer, its form wavering like a mirage. I miss you, Emily. Please come back. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the figure reached for her, its face filled with sorrow. But then the flashlight flickered again, and the figure's features twisted, its eyes turning black and its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. Emily stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The figure dissolved into the fog, leaving only the whispers behind. Emily! Sam's voice broke through the haze, snapping her out of her trance. She turned and ran toward the sound, her legs trembling beneath her. Ahead, she saw Sam struggling to hold Mia back, his arms wrapped tightly around her. Let me go! Mia screamed, clawing at him. He's here! I can hear him! It's not real! Sam shouted, his voice desperate. Emily reached them and grabbed Mia's shoulders, shaking her. Mia, look at me! It's lying to you! Mia's struggles weakened, and she collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing. But it sounded just like him, she whispered, her voice broken. It was him! It wasn't! Emily said firmly, though her own voice wavered. Whatever this thing is, it knows how to trick us. We can't listen to it. Sam nodded, his face pale. We need to keep moving. If we stay here, it'll only get worse. The group pressed on, the whispers fading into the distance. But their unease only grew. The fog seemed thicker now, heavier, as if it were alive. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they came across another chilling sight. A line of cairns, small stacks of stones, lined the path, each one marked with a name scratched into the rocks. People who've died here, Sam said, his voice hollow. Emily crouched beside one of the cairns, tracing the name with her fingers, Victor H. Her breath hitched. No, that's not possible. It's playing with us, Sam said, pulling her to her feet. We can't let it mess with our heads. Mia stared at the cairns, her face pale. If Victor's here, does that mean we're next? Emily couldn't answer. She turned away from the stones, her hands trembling, and forced herself to keep walking. The whispers returned as they continued, but now they were louder, angrier. You can't escape, they hissed. You'll never leave. Emily gritted her teeth, her resolve hardening. We'll see about that, she muttered, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, the fog swallowing their path. But they had no choice but to keep going. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, like a chorus of unseen voices. And somewhere in the distance, the growl returned. The growl echoed ominously, low and guttural, reverberating through the dense fog that pressed against them. The hikers huddled closer together, their every step tentative, as if the ground beneath them might crumble at any moment. Emily kept her flashlight aimed forward, its beam cutting feebly through the oppressive gray. Her knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Keep moving, she urged, though her own voice trembled. We can't stop now. Sam followed close behind, his eyes darting to every shadow that flickered at the edge of their vision. He carried the broken camera in one hand, its cold metal pressing into his palm as if it might offer some sense of stability. Mia lagged behind, clutching her injured ankle. She hadn't spoken since her outburst, her face pale and drawn. The growl came again, closer this time. Is it following us? Sam whispered, fear lacing his words. Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel it. That suffocating presence, like eyes boring into her back. growing stronger with every step. "Stay together," she said firmly, glancing over her shoulder. They reached a small clearing, where the fog thinned just enough to reveal more strange markings carved into the ground. These were different, spirals within spirals, radiating outward in chaotic patterns. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's another marker," Emily said, crouching to examine the symbols. "Or a warning." Sam knelt beside her, his flashlight illuminating the carvings. "These patterns, they're different from the ones we've seen before. More erratic. Like it's getting worse," Mia said, her voice breaking. Emily stood, her chest tightening as she scanned the clearing. The fog swirled around them, shifting like a living thing. Then she saw them, two faint, glowing orbs hovering in the mist. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Sam turned, his flashlight beam catching the orbs. They were eyes, large, pale, and unblinking, set in a gaunt, shadowy face. "Run," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature stepped forward, its elongated limbs moving with unnatural fluidity. Its eyes glowed brighter, and the fog seemed to retreat from its presence, revealing its full form. It was tall, impossibly so, its skeletal frame draped in tattered remnants of what might have once been clothing. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though it were studying them with a cruel intelligence. "Run!" Emily shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her forward. The hikers bolted from the clearing, their footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. The creature followed, its movements slow but deliberate, each step impossibly long. "This way," Sam shouted, veering off the trail toward a narrow crevice in the rock. Emily and Mia followed, squeezing through the tight gap. The jagged walls scraped their arms and legs, but they didn't stop. Behind them, the creature let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the rocks like thunder. They emerged on the other side, breathless and trembling. The trail was gone, replaced by a rocky slope that descended into darkness. "We're off the path," Mia said, panic rising in her voice. "It doesn't matter," Emily said, her mind racing. "We need to keep moving." Sam peered down the slope, his flashlight barely illuminating the bottom. "This is suicide. We don't even know where it leads." "Do you want to stay here?" Emily snapped, her fear boiling into anger. Another roar erupted behind them, closer now. The fog began to seep through the crevice, curling around their feet like ghostly tendrils. Emily didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed Mia's hand and started down the slope, the loose rocks sliding beneath her boots. Sam hesitated, then followed, his breathing ragged. The descent was harrowing, every step threatening to send them tumbling into the darkness. The fog clung to them, growing colder and heavier, as though it were trying to drag them back. At last, they reached the bottom, where the ground leveled out into a wide cavern. The air was damp and stale, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. "Where are we?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Sam shone his flashlight around the cavern, revealing jagged stalactites hanging from the ceiling like rows of teeth. In the center of the space was a crude stone altar, covered in more of the spiraling symbols. "This is wrong," Sam muttered, his voice barely audible. Emily approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. There was something resting on its surface, a bundle of tattered papers held together by a rusted clasp. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and flipped through the pages. The writing was frantic and uneven, the words scrawled in a language she didn't recognize. But there were drawings, crude but unmistakable. They depicted the shadowy figures, their eyes glowing, surrounding what appeared to be human sacrifices. The final image was of a spiral, twisting downward into darkness. "We shouldn't be here," Mia said, backing away from the altar. "We didn't have a choice," Emily replied, though her voice wavered. The growl returned, louder than ever, reverberating through the cavern like an earthquake. The hikers turned toward the sound, their flashlights catching movement in the shadows. The creature had found them. Its glowing eyes burned brighter as it stepped into the cavern, its skeletal form towering over them. Behind it, more figures emerged from the fog, their featureless faces and twisting limbs a nightmare made real. Sam clutched his broken camera, his hands trembling. What do we do? Emily stared at the advancing figures, her mind racing. We fight. The creatures roared, and the cavern descended into chaos. The cavern erupted in chaos as the shadowy figures advanced, their guttural roars shaking the very ground beneath the hikers' feet. Emily raised her flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive fog as she searched for an escape. There's too many of them, Sam shouted, his voice trembling as he backed toward the altar. Mia clung to Emily, her body shaking with fear. We're trapped. No, Emily said, her voice steely despite the terror coursing through her. We're not done yet. She turned her focus to the spiral carvings etched into the stone altar, their patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. The frantic scrawls in the journal replayed in her mind. Sacrifices, spirals, and a descent into darkness. What if this is a way out? She murmured, more to herself and the others. A way out? Sam shot back, his voice edged with panic. It's an altar, for sacrifices, or a door, Emily countered, her eyes narrowing. The figures moved closer, their twisted limbs flickering like static as they glided toward the hikers. We don't have time to argue, Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. If you have a plan, do it now. Emily knelt by the altar, flipping through the tattered journal she had taken from the site. The crude illustrations of spirals seemed to grow clearer, as if the very presence of the creatures activated them. I think we have to complete the pattern, she said, pointing to the glowing spirals carved into the ground. Sam hesitated, then dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he began tracing the missing sections with a piece of chalk from his pack. If this doesn't work, we're dead. Then hurry, Emily urged, standing to guard him. The creatures drew closer, their glowing eyes fixed on the hikers. One of them lunged forward, its claw-like hand swiping at Emily. She stumbled back, swinging her flashlight at its head. The light seemed to repel it, and it shrieked, retreating momentarily. Keep them back, Sam shouted, frantically finishing the spiral. Emily swung her flashlight in wide arcs, keeping the creatures at bay. Mia stood frozen, her fear paralyzing her as the shadows loomed over her. Mia, moo! Emily screamed, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the advancing figures. Sam completed the spiral with a final stroke, and the entire pattern glowed with an otherworldly light. The cavern trembled, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air, drowning out the roars of the creatures. What's happening? Mia cried, shielding her eyes from the light. The spirals began to twist, their glowing lines seeming to sink into the stone itself. A dark void opened at the center of the altar, pulling the fog and the figures toward it. It's working, Sam shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. The creatures howled in fury, their forms flickering wildly as the pull of the void grew stronger. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness, their glowing eyes fading as they disappeared. But the pull didn't stop. Emily felt her feet slide across the ground as the void began to draw her in. She grabbed onto the altar, her fingers scraping against the rough stone. It's pulling everything, she screamed. Hold on. Mia clung to a jagged rock, her face twisted with terror. We can't hold on forever. Sam tried to move toward them, but the pull was too strong. He lost his footing and fell, his body sliding toward the spiraling void. Emily cried, reaching out for him. Their hands brushed for a brief moment before the void claimed him, his scream echoing as he vanished into the darkness. Mia sobbed, her grip slipping. Emily's arms burned as she struggled to hold on, her strength failing. The void's pull was relentless, the spirals glowing brighter as they twisted faster. Emily, let go, Mia shouted, her voice desperate. What? It's the only way out. Mia screamed. We have to go through it. Emily's mind raced. Was Mia right? Or was this another trick of the trail? She looked into the void, its inky blackness swirling like a storm. and felt the oppressive gaze of something ancient and hungry. But there was no other choice. With a final breath, Emily released her grip. The pull of the void claimed her, and she plunged into the spiraling darkness, the world around her dissolving into nothingness. The last thing she heard was Mia's scream as the void swallowed them both. Then there was silence. Emily's eyes fluttered open to an eerie stillness. The oppressive pull of the void was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling silence. She lay on cold, damp ground, the air thick with a metallic tang. "Am I dead?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her body ached, but as she slowly sat up, she realized she was unhurt. The surroundings were shrouded in darkness, with faint ripples of light tracing across the ground like liquid starlight. She wasn't alone. "Mia?" she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. A weak groan answered her. She scrambled toward the sound, finding Mia sprawled on the ground nearby, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Emily," Mia croaked, her voice trembling. "I'm here," Emily said, pulling her close. The two clung to each other, their breaths ragged as they tried to make sense of their surroundings. They were in a vast, featureless expanse, the ground slick and cold beneath them. Above, the sky was an endless void, devoid of stars or light. "Where are we?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Emily admitted, her heart pounding. "But we're alive." A faint sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from all directions at once. Emily turned, her flashlight flickering weakly, its beam swallowed by the surrounding darkness. "What is that?" Mia asked, clutching Emily's arm. The pulse grew louder, and with it came movement. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, their forms indistinct but eerily familiar. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her grip on Mia tightening. The shapes grew clearer as they approached. They were human figures, their faces pale and featureless, their movements slow and deliberate. "No," Mia whimpered, her voice breaking. Among the figures, Emily recognized one, Victor. His outline was unmistakable, his weathered jacket and steady gait. But his face was blank, a smooth expanse where his features should have been. "It's them," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The ones the trail took." The figures didn't attack. Instead, they stood in eerie silence, surrounding the two women. Their presence was suffocating, their blank faces staring without eyes. "What do you want?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. One of the figures stepped forward. It was taller than the others, its limbs impossibly long, its movements fluid and alien. When it spoke, its voice was a blend of countless whispers. "You cannot leave." Emily's blood ran cold. "Why? What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. "The trail hungers. You will feed it, as all the others have." Mia clung to Emily, her body shaking with fear. "We're not staying here. We'll find a way out." The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony. "There is no escape. The trail is everything. It has always been." Emily's mind raced. They had survived the void, surely there was still a way out. Her eyes darted to the faint ripples of light on the ground, the only source of motion in the oppressive darkness. "What about the spiral?" she asked, her voice rising. "It brought us here. Can it take us out?" The figure tilted its head again, its blank face somehow radiating disdain. "The spiral is the gate. It opens only one way." "No," Emily said firmly, her voice hardening. "There's always another way." She turned to Mia, her expression resolute. "We're not staying here. Not like them." "But how?" Mia asked, tears streaming down her face. Emily grabbed her flashlight, its beam weak but steady. She shone it at the figures, who recoiled slightly, their forms flickering like static. "They don't like the light," she said, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. She turned the beam to the rippling light on the ground. It shimmered, forming faint spirals that pulsed rhythmically. "The spiral," Emily murmured. "It's still active." The figures surged forward, their movements growing more erratic. "Go!" Emily shouted, dragging Mia toward the light. The two women sprinted across the slick ground, their feet slipping on the strange surface. The figures gave chase, their guttural whispers rising into a deafening roar. Emily reached the center of the spirals and dropped to her knees, frantically tracing the patterns with her hands. The light grew brighter, pulsing in time with her movements. "Emily, hurry!" Mia screamed, the figures closing in. With a final stroke, the spiral flared to life, its glow blinding. The ground trembled, and the figures froze, their forms flickering wildly. A deafening crack split the air, and the spirals collapsed inward, pulling Emily and Mia into a torrent of light. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding brightness and the sensation of falling. Then, with a jolt, Emily opened her eyes. She was back at the trailhead. The rusted gate loomed before her, the faded sign swaying in the breeze. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm light over the forest. "Mia," she called, her voice trembling. A soft groan answered her. She turned to find Mia lying on the ground nearby, her face streaked with dirt but alive. "We made it," Mia whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Emily pulled her into a tight embrace, her own tears flowing freely. But as they stood, the forest seemed quieter than before. The trees loomed taller, their shadows darker. Behind them, on the ground, a faint spiral glowed, then faded into nothingness. They had escaped the trail. But deep in the forest, the trail was waiting. And it was hungry,